Hello, I'm Lugatorix and welcome to my Scotland faction guide for Medieval 2 Total War. Today we're going to be discussing the faction of Scotland, its position on the campaign map, its strengths, weaknesses, units, all of that. And well, let's just get straight into it. To complete the long campaign you have to hold 45 regions, including the Jerusalem region. Scotland's strengths are they make excellent use of spears and pikes, but their weaknesses is that they lack cavalry and the nobles often prefer to fight on foot. So, pretty interesting faction Scotland. Starts off with one settlement, Edinburgh, in what is now modern day Scotland, tucked up all the way in the corner over here. And as a Catholic faction, you have to really slog your way through a lot of other Catholic factions to make any progress. I mean, there really is not a huge amount of room for expansion into either Orthodox or Muslim territory. You kind of have to just go to all the English factions, and some of them are a lot stronger than you are, so it can be quite a tricky faction to play as, but certainly a fun one indeed. But first, let's have a look at the units, and we'll talk about it from there. So here are the Scottish units, and you can see there is actually not a lot of them. Scotland has not exactly got one of the most diverse armies in the game, that is for sure. But we'll get straight into it, and we're going to start off with Highland Rabble. This is one of the few factions which doesn't have peasants, or not in the traditional sense anyway. They're not called peasants, so I don't have to actually repeat myself for once. These guys are ill-disciplined and fierce peasants. I mean, yeah, okay, they are peasants, but they're not called it. From the Highlands, armed with basic hand weapon. So yeah, these guys are pretty much the same though. 2 attack, 1 defense. They are not very useful indeed, but I mean they're useful for, you know, because they're very low upkeep and all of that, for just sort of garrisoning settlements which are just never going to be attacked in a million years, and that's pretty much all they're useful for. They're going to break straight away, although actually these guys have not got poor morale as opposed to the other European peasants which do have poor morale. So they are a step up, a little tiny step up from other peasants, but really they're nothing that amazing, that's for sure. Instead we'll move on to the town militia. Now this is a faction, or sorry, a unit that a lot of factions, particularly the European factions, have in the game. These guys are certainly a step up from peasants. They have an attack of 5, defense of 7. They don't have poor morale either. These guys are basically useful in the early game for defending regions. I mean, you know, they're not terrible. They're just going to become redundant relatively quickly. But, you know, certainly a solid, reliable defensive unit in the early game that can do a little bit of a job. 7 defense isn't too bad at all. But, I mean, really they're just used for sort of garrisoning settlements and being a sort of last resort thing just to defend your settlement. Low upkeep though is a good reason why you'd want to use these guys. Now we have the Highlanders. Now the Highlanders are interesting. I don't tend to use them a lot because, well, they haven't got great defense. These are fierce and wild warriors from the Scottish Highlands. They fight with little to no armour and are equipped with an axe. Now the attack of 11 is pretty solid for the early game. If you compare them to the town militia, it's over double that of them. But a defense of 4 isn't really that good. These guys are quite reckless in the sense that they just charge forward with an axe and try and chop everyone's head off, but they don't really care for their own safety. So in the right situation, certainly can be useful as an offensive unit. And, you know, they're going to be the best offensive unit you get in the early game because these guys are relatively defensive. So if you want to sort of have a sort of a shock charge in the early game, you know, to get a unit routing or to inflict a large amount of damage in a short amount of time, sure, Highlanders can certainly do that, but you've got to be careful with them because a charge into the back of them or something like that, and they're just going to go down pretty quickly because they lack that armour or a big shield. Now we're going to go on to the Scots Pike Militia. Lowland Scots levied into a militia to defend their settlement, armed with pikes and for good defense against cavalry, but lacking in armour. Yeah, they very much lack in armour. 1 defense is nothing incredible at all. In fact, it is basically the same as the Highland Rabble. Now, 7 attack is okay. These guys are basically, because they've got very long spears, and they can form a spear wall, they're relatively defensible if you put them, clogging them up in a street, on the walls or against cavalry, somewhere where they're going to have a solid defense from the side and the back, and they can just let units charge into the front and they'll be relatively protected because they're far away, physically far away from the cavalry unit because of their spear wall and long spears. But as the game alludes to, any sort of charge from the back of the side and they're going to disintegrate immediately. So useful in certain situations if, you know, you need a unit to defend a passageway or a tight area, but you've got to make sure that lads can't get around the back of them because they're going to be pretty much screwed. Not the most reliable unit because they're not particularly flexible in terms of what they can defend, but solid unit indeed. They can do a decent job, particularly if you're facing a large cavalry-based army. But we also have the Highland Pikemen, well trained but sometimes reckless clansmen armed with pikes, able to form a wall of pikes against cavalry. Pikes were said too many times then. 9 attack, 3 defense with a charge bonus of 3 as well. They may charge without orders, they're a little bit disorderly in that respect, but they're very long spears and the bonus fighting cavalry makes them relatively similar to the Scots Pike Militia, but they do have a slightly better defense, only 2. Again, 3 defense isn't amazing. These guys are a little bit reckless. I don't have a huge liking towards them because this is the kind of unit, if you're going to want to defend against cavalry, you're going to want to have a unit that stands there, stays their ground, and just is disciplined and will not break. Now, if these guys start charging forward or something like that, and put themselves into an awkward position where they can get, flanked or hit in the rear by cavalry, then they're going to be screwed very, very quickly because they haven't got armor and they've only got 3 defense. So, not a huge fan personally. I don't like the fact they're reckless, but then you're playing as Scotland, that's kind of what you have to expect. This isn't the most orderly army you're ever going to see. Now we're going to move on to the Spear Militia. Spear Militia, honestly, pretty similar to Town Militia in many respects. 5 attack, 7 defense. These guys can form a Skiltrum. They do have a bonus fighting cavalry. They are a step up from the Town Militia, but not by a huge margin at all. They are very, very slightly more expensive to train and maintain because they're very, very slightly better. Not a huge amount to say about these guys, but again will do a solid defensive job, particularly in defending settlements and being a good garrison unit in the early game. Then we move on to Heavy Pike Militia. Now this is better, this is more like it, because these guys actually have a defense of 11. They're very similar to these guys, but they actually have good armor, meaning if they do get charged into the back or the side, they're going to stand up a lot more. So actually a much more reliable unit, but obviously this is a later game unit. So there you go. They have good armor, so they're going to be less vulnerable to missile fire and stuff like that. But this is a very, very solid defensive unit that's going to form a spear wall, and cavalry is going to have a hard time trying to penetrate that line. Not the most diverse unit ever, but not too bad indeed. Then we get onto the Noble Pikemen. Well-armoured pikemen made up of Scottish nobles preferring to fight in the infantry. And this is what the game was saying at the beginning. The nobles of other factions usually fight on cavalry, not the Scots. They like to get down and dirty on the ground and fight hand to hand without the use of a stupid horse. Now, they can form a spear wall, well armoured, good stamina, very long spears, good morale. These guys are going to stand, defend a position, fight against the cavalry all day. So if you are fighting a very cavalry based army like the Poles, for example, we talked about them last episode, then yeah, sure, these are going to do a very, very solid job. But even against infantry, they're just going to stand and fight. They've got thick metal armour. They're going to stand and fight all day. Very unlikely to break. Solid unit and a lot more orderly than some of these other guys. I'm particularly looking at the Highlanders and the Highland Pikemen. So not too bad indeed. Talking of Highlanders, let's move on to Highland Nobles. Scottish shock troops wielding a large two-handed sword and armoured in chain. Now this is where the Scottish get badass. Two-handed swords, big armour. This sounds like something from Skyrim or something. Okay, 14 attack, 9 defense with a charge bonus of 6. Charge bonus of 6 for infantry. Very solid indeed. These guys, what they're good for, getting a good charge into the flank or the rear, particularly of enemy infantry. If a unit looks like it's shaken or wavering and you just need them to break, get the Highland Nobles in there with their two-handed sword and just get them to chop some heads off or something like that. That's what they're certainly good at. And the Scots are very, very good at having shock infantry that can just change and turn the tide of a battle just like that by inflicting a huge amount of damage and particularly morale damage in a very short amount of time. But also, these guys, good morale. So they're going to stand and fight all day as well. So they're unlikely to break, but they're very likely to break other units, which is very, very good. And then we have dismounted feudal knights. This is a pretty damn solid unit. 13 attack, 21 defense. Knights would often dismount and fight on foot when the situation demands it. Dismounted, they make excellent heavy infantry, and you're not joking. Very well armoured, good morale, good stamina. These guys are going to fight with their sword and shield all day and do a good amount of damage. And 21 defense for infantry, very, very solid indeed. Especially this is a sort of more offensive unit of infantry. To have that 21 defense is relatively good. And you can get these guys in the pretty early game. I mean, you know, in my campaign, I'm playing a Scotland campaign at the moment, I've got access to these guys pretty early on, and they're doing a good amount of damage to inferior, comparatively inferior infantry of other factions. They do a good job, not even that expensive either, quite like them indeed. And then finally, we're going to move on to Noble Swordsman, strong Scottish melee unit, armed with sword and shield and wearing plate armour. 13 attack, 22 defense, good morale, well armoured, good stamina. Again, very similar unit. These guys are going to fight and do a damn good job, particularly in the late game. They're a tough unit. I would not want to face them in battle. They're going to scare the enemy, that's for sure. Now we're going to move on to the missile troops, and this is something that Scotland severely lacks. You know, other factions, they have crossbows, they have musketeers, all that. Scotland have none of this. They rely purely on archers. So in the early game, not too bad on the old missile front, but technologically they very much fall behind as the game goes on, and that is a little bit of a concern if you're playing as Scotland. But anyway, we're going to start off with peasant archers, which I've mentioned many times before. Not particularly good in the melee. 2 1-on-1 is pretty much reminiscent of the Highland rabble, but missile attack of 5 is okay. These guys are going to do a solid job in the early game, just firing, doing a bit of damage from a distance, particularly if you put them up on walls. You know, their fiery arrows and all that can set rams on fire and all that, so not too bad at all, but you know, nothing amazing, particularly in the melee, but that's not what you expect them to do anyway. You know, they're an alright effective unit as archers, but again, in the late game, because they haven't got that armor piercing or any crossbow bolts, anything like that, they're going to fall behind and become less and less effective as the campaign goes on. But we're going to move on to Highland archers. Now, honestly, these are basically the same, but they are better in the attack and defense. Not much better, not amazing. 7 attack and 4 defense. These guys are a little bit more reliable in the melee, but that's not what you need archers for anyway. But it's nice to have that sort of backup just in case somehow the enemy manages to get around the flank or around the rear and charges into these guys or gets up on the wall somehow. At least they're not going to die straight away, but I would not rely on them in the melee, that is for sure. And their missile attack is a little bit underwhelming if I'm being totally honest. But then we move on to Noble Highland Archers. Missile attack of 7 is a little bit better, but these guys, the good thing about these guys is they're a lot more reliable in the melee. Good morale is quite rare for archers in this game, well, in fact in any Total War game. 9 attack, 12 defense, a very, very solid job indeed, and good stamina as well, meaning these guys can do a decent amount, pretty solid amount of actually damage for archers, but also if they get caught or if they run out of missiles, they don't become redundant and die immediately, because actually they can hold their own in combat, because they've got a little bit of a hand axe. I mean, that's pretty badass. Axeman archers, I quite like that indeed. But no crossbowmen, no arquebusiers, meaning you're going to fall behind the Catholic factions pretty quickly, which could serve to be a problem. I mean, in my campaign, I've recruited a lot of mercenary crossbowmen because sometimes I need them to pierce the armour of enemy troops. So, you know, that's something you have to consider. Rely on mercenaries to, you know, be your missile troops, because this is something that Scotland lack. But we're going to get on to the cavalry now, and we start off with Border Horse. Equipped with light mail and spear, this unit is handy for outflanking your opponent and chasing down archers. 9 attack, 9 defense, 4 charge. I mean, that's a pretty solid description of them. Border Horse, light infantry, fast moving, and that's what they're good for. You're not going to have them charging in and then fighting for a prolonged period of time in combat. That's not really a good idea, but chasing down routing units they can do. If archers have overexposed themselves, they're going to be a good unit to sort of chase them down or get some free kills in the early game. Not particularly strong and hardy, but fast moving, you know, sort of relatively reminiscent to the Equites of Rome Total War, for example. But then we move on to the Merchant Cavalry Militia, poorly trained but well equipped cavalry who fight with a sword. 14 defense is certainly a step up in the defense, but attack of 6, not particularly amazing. I don't use these guys much. They're okay, they're just not particularly special. Now, Mailed Knights I do use a lot more. Attack of 10 is okay. I mean, it's a little bit underwhelming compared to other factions. 14 defense is pretty solid, but what I like about them, good morale, good stamina. It means that if you do have to charge and really, you know, slog your way through an army, then the Mailed Knights can do a good job, because they're going to stand and fight until they're pretty much their last man. So, you know, they are, as the game says, they're formidable fighting machines, and that is certainly not an exaggeration. But then we have the Feudal Knights, which are basically a step up from them, if in all honesty. Protected by heavy armour and armed with a lance, these elite warriors crush and ride down their opponents. Good charge, they're powerful cavalry with 16 defense. They're good morale as well. They're going to stand up and do a good amount of damage as well. I've used these guys quite a lot in my campaign, along with the mailed knights, because they're just reliable cavalry. Nothing hugely amazing. Other factions certainly have better cavalry, but they'll certainly do a good job. Now, the General's Bodyguard is a relatively standard unit. You've all seen General's Bodyguard before. They're going to be good because they're protecting the General. 13 attack, 16 defense, 2 hit points, and a charge bonus of 8. Coupled with good morale, powerful charge, well armoured and very good stamina. These guys are going to protect the General and do a solid job in that regard. And then you have the late period General's Bodyguard, which is pretty much the same, but just better armoured. You can see that horse is looking pretty badass in his metal, whatever armour that is. These are elite cavalry because they are handpicked to protect the General. So, obviously they're going to be a good unit. Now we have the Knights Templar. And I say this every episode, I'm going to say it again. Any unit fighting for their faith is going to do a good job because they fight that a little bit harder for that a little bit longer. Elite and some say reckless knights formed to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. 13 attack, 16 defense, 8 charge, which is the best we've seen alongside the General's Bodyguard, of course. Some very good stats and some very good traits as well. This cavalry will stand and fight for their faith, which is pretty solid indeed. And then the Knights Hospitalia, very similar. Again, it's some of the deadliest heavy cavalry in all of Christendom. They're going to stand and fight for their faith. But the Scottish cavalry, a little bit underwhelming. If you compare to some of my other faction guides, some of them have got a lot better cavalry. Particularly, I'm noticing the late game cavalry. The stats are just not as comparable. 10 and 16 is a bit underwhelming. I've seen factions where the cavalry has been in the 20s for some of these stats. So, Scotland does lack on missiles and cavalry, but they do have some very solid infantry. So it kind of makes up for it, but if you like cavalry, then go for a faction like Poland or something like that, because this probably won't be the faction for you. The same goes for missile troops, and no missile cavalry either. None at all. So if that's your thing, maybe go and look at Russia or Poland or the Moors or something like that. Or maybe even, if you like the Javelin cavalry, go and look at Portugal. Who knows? Now, I talked about the artillery and the siege equipment, all that in my England faction guide. It's pretty much the same for most factions, to be honest. So if you want to have a look at that, go to the England faction guide and you can have a look at it there. I just don't particularly want to repeat myself every episode. But we are going to finish off by having a look at the Gallo Glaich. I think that's how you say it. I don't know. These guys, you can recruit them as mercenaries in Ireland, I believe. Yeah, there you go. Fierce Scottish warriors who have settled in Ireland. Formidable troops armed with large two-handed axes and wearing light armour. Very solid troop indeed. You'll see these guys in, I believe the first time I saw them in my campaign was actually in a rebel settlement. It was in Dublin. And 17 attack, 9 defence. Very, very solid unit indeed. It's sometimes useful just to have a general in Ireland just to pick these guys up, because particularly in the early game, which is where you first can get access to them, 17 attack is really comparable to like some of these guys. In fact, much higher than some of these guys. Now, the defense is not amazing, but this is the kind of unit more like the Highlanders, with they just have their massive axe and flipping like Skyrim walk style, just come in and just chop heads off and charge in and kill a lot of men. Shock troop can do a lot of damage in a short amount of time, and they will stand and fight because of that good morale. So I do like these guys indeed. They can be very, very useful for sure, particularly as you lack that real attacking presence sometimes of Scotland. So very nice unit indeed. So now we're going to move on to the strategy, the campaign map, and I'll see you in a minute. So here is the starting position for Scotland, and it's a rare faction. I believe only Russia and a few other factions have this, where they start off with only one settlement, and that is Edinburgh for the Scots. Now I'm gonna very quickly turn off the fog of war, and the reason for that is, as I say every time, I don't play with the fog of war off, but it's just so I can see what's going on and show you what's going on. Is a lot easier to explain. Now, as you only have one settlement, it is imperative, especially as England is nearby and potentially the Danes and France and whatever, that you expand quickly. Just as that insurance, because if they for some reason take Edinburgh quickly, then you're screwed, because that's the end of the campaign for you. So, what would I do? Well, I'm going to plug my campaign as well again, but what I did in my campaign, in the first couple of turns, I went and took York. And the reason I took York very quickly is because the English will have their eyes on it if you take it. If you don't take it very quickly. And you don't want the English expanding quickly. You want to contain the English in Nottingham and London and the French settlement. And make sure you take the settlements. You don't want to give them free settlements. Okay, that's a free, easy settlement to take. York has got no walls. It's got rubbish peasant troops. Take it quickly and make sure the English don't get there first, because it's just going to give them more money, more recruitment, and it's going to make them stronger, unnecessarily stronger in the early game. So make sure you go and take York quickly, but also Inverness is a nice one to take in the first couple of turns as well. So what I did was, in my campaign, I split the troops in half. Half of them went up to Inverness. It's a tricky settlement to take because it is a wooden castle, so it's got decent walls and all that, and a solid amount of garrison, decent troops. It's got like Highlanders and stuff like that. So pretty solid indeed. So make sure you bring a decent amount of force to Inverness, a lesser force to York, and you can take them within the first 2 or 3 turns. That's what I did, and it really did pay off. So once you do that, well, again, go and swallow up the rebel settlements. I went straight for Dublin. Go straight for... Now, Dublin is a tricky one to take. There are no walls, but pretty decent garrison. And as I talked, there are Gallo Glace, which I mentioned in the a couple of minutes ago, are pretty damn solid units. So make sure you bring a decent force from Inverness over to take Dublin, and then get straight over and take Carnarvon. Best case scenario, which is what happened in my campaign, you can take all 4 of these rebel settlements before England does, and then they're pretty much screwed because you've actually got more territory than they do, a bigger economy, more recruitment and all that, and also you don't allow the English to get strong. So now what do you do? Well, the trick is with a Catholic faction, if you don't want to get excommunicated, is baiting factions into attacking you. So what did I do? I thought, well, I don't want to attack England. They're being relatively passive, so I'll go and try and take Bruges and Antwerp. So what I did then, went over to Bruges and Antwerp and tried to take them, and then eventually the English were like, no, we're going to attack you. And then once they engage in war, go for it, swarm them. If you surround them from all sides, they're going to be screwed. But the imperative thing is, make sure you take Britain early on. That's got to be your priority at the very, very beginning, is make sure you have Britain as a sort of solid, stable homeland. The great thing about Britain is it's an island, so it's going to be harder for men to get over. Now, invariably the Portuguese will come over, the Danes will get a ship and come over, the French might even, but it's more defensible. If you secure this as a stronghold early on, kick the English out, then you're going to be in a very good position to use this as a base to expand on later in the campaign. Now, what would I do after that? Well, what did I do in the campaign? It's very much a matter of expanding south and trying to bait factions into attacking you. So the French, if you start destroying the English, the French will pick up on this and be like, hell nah, you ain't going to do this. We need to actually start attacking you. And at that point, you've got to just force your way through France. It's tricky. But basically, all I can say is consolidate as a Britain as a sort of homeland, as a recruiting area to get a lot of troops and money coming into the faction early on, and then just force your way south and try and get to the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean is where the profit, the money, the trade is. So that's kind of what I do. Now, there are people that would say, screw that, yep, go and take Britain, but then instead of going for France and the big dogs like Holy Roman Empire, go for Denmark. And there is certainly a viable argument for going for Denmark. Denmark is weaker. They start off with only 1 settlement as well, and you can take these relatively easy settlements like Oslo and Stockholm and Helsinki if you really want to go that far early on. I'm just less keen on that personally. I prefer just getting rid of the big Catholic factions before they get too big. Get rid of England, get rid of France before they just overexpand and become massive and uncontrollable. Bear in mind, you're weak early on, so they're just going to get stronger and stronger. You're going to get weaker and weaker if you take rubbish or not as amazing settlements like Oslo up here. That's personally my advice. So there's not a huge amount to say. Go watch my campaign if you want to see what I did, but no, you don't have to, it's fine. But definitely consolidate Britain as a homeland. I would focus on the English first, just try and get rid of them because they're an annoyance, and then I would personally just chug your way south and try and get rid of the big dogs before it's too late, because remember, you're Scotland, and as I alluded to earlier on in the video, you're going to become technologically disadvantaged later on. These guys are going to have big crossbows and arquebusiers and musketeers. You're not going to have that. So you've got to expand quickly early on and get an advantage before they get an advantage over you. That's my advice personally. But that's pretty much all I've got to say. Thank you very much for watching the video, and I'll be back with more very, very soon. Thank you very much, and I'll see you around.